Thanks so much, Frank. A couple of weeks away from submitting, so no pressure there. I'm really delighted to be here and to be moderating the first panel. As a public servant, the ANU Energy Update is always, a must-attend event because it's a unique opportunity to hear from academics, from industry, and from the experts in the public service as well. And so the topic of our first panel today is towards net zero in Australia's energy and industry sector. And I'm particularly pleased to have a fabulous group of experts. I do have to start off by noting that one of our excellent speakers, Joe Morrison, who is CEO of the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, is unfortunately unable to join us. We did make significant efforts to try and find a replacement speaker, but we were unable to do so. So, we at the ANU and in the public service and more broadly, see the clean energy transition to net zero as a huge opportunity to, work with the First Nations communities to improve equality for all Australians. And, I think that's something that we'll sort of touch on in discussions down the track. But the way that this session is going to work is that I'll invite each of the speakers on the panel to come and give a short sort of 5-minute presentation, and then we'll sort of move to some moderated questions before we throw it open to the audience and to the online people watching today to ask questions of the panel. And so I'm delighted to introduce the first speaker today, Brad Archer, who is the CEO of the Climate Change Authority. And Brad has extensive experience working on climate change, renewable energy and energy market issues. He's been at the authority since November 2018, but before that was head of the International Climate Change and Energy Innovation Division at the Department of Environment and Energy. And has been working on climate change policies for much longer than that. And prior to working on environment issues, he was with Treasury. Brad was actually my boss for a number of years. And I remember once in a job interview, he asked me, Chell, what do you do when you have a difficult problem that you need to solve? And I said to him, well, Brad, I go and I read, the evidence around the issue, but then I always go and ask a bunch of people who are smarter than me what they think about it. And from that, I draw a judgment about, what's the best way forward. Brad is definitely one of those people smarter than me that I go to ask about those kinds of issues. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce him today. Thanks, Brad.
In terms of, so I'm going to try and distill our 230-page sector pathways review into a few key points in what is now probably more like 4 minutes than 5 minutes. One of the key inputs to our work was modelling that we did in conjunction with the CSIRO, which contributed its modelling expertise. What that tells us is that obviously, we need every sector contributing to the task of achieving net zero. Historically, in Australia, emissions have been coming down since we've been tracking them in 1990, largely as a result of changes in the way we use our land and less land clearing. And then more recently, of course, because of the shift to renewables and away particularly from coal in our power generation. So we need all sectors on a trajectory to net zero, but they'll be different trajectories because the state of technologies with respect to reducing emissions in each of them differs, and the cost profiles of what we need to achieve currently based on what we know today do differ. The two scenarios that we looked at were a scenario where globally we're on track to keep global warming below 2 degrees. Within that scenario, we looked at Australia from the point of view of achieving its current targets, so net zero by 2050, a reduction of minus 43% on 2005 levels in 2030. And we looked at a second scenario, a more ambitious scenario, one more in keeping with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. In that scenario, we looked at Australia achieving net zero by 2040, and that implies overachieving on the current 2030 target. So when we look at across the different sectors, the state of technologies, we see that sort of two large buckets, if you like. The technologies that are proven are rolling out already at scale, reducing emissions, particularly in the electricity sector, of course. And then another category of technologies which are really only at the demonstration stage or prototype stage, and which We'll need further R&D, further investment, so we can get to the point where we can deploy them at scale. So the task really is to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to get on with accelerating the deployment of the existing technologies, which we know are proven, which can deliver emissions reductions immediately, while at the same time continuing to invest and develop those technologies which will be needed to address emissions a bit further down the track. The solutions are not quite there yet. And the CSRO analysis and our analysis suggests that about 30% of the emissions reductions or abatement that we need in 2050 will need to come from that bucket of technologies which aren't yet necessarily proven or being rolled out at scale. When we think about, again, across the different sectors, a key aspect of the review is that there are a lot of interdependencies. And Matt Keen's already spoken about the fact that reducing emissions from electricity is very important. Not only does it account for about a third of Australia's total emissions, but decarbonising electricity unlocks abatement opportunities right across the rest of the economy. And so if you look through the technologies that we've identified against each sector, electrification appears in pretty much all of them. So that ability to get off fossil fuels, whether they're being used to generate energy on site, in mining operations, industrial operations, where the electricity is off grid, and also then where fossil fuels are being used to generate heat for industrial processes. We've got opportunities to electrify that. That only works, of course, if we're decarbonising our electricity supply. So if you look at the profiles that we have for our sectoral trajectories, you see that electricity emissions are declining rapidly relative to the other sectors. That's a combination of the fact that we have the technology to do that, but then also really we need to do that to enable the abatement opportunities to be pursued in the other sectors. And then just to finish off, part of our terms of reference for the review wasn't just about focusing on the technology and emissions pathways, but on the challenges or the barriers that might stand in the way of getting on these pathways to net zero. Absolutely want to emphasise that the report is not just about modelling, it's not just about technologies. The net zero transition is very much a major economic transition and a major social transition. And again, Matt alluded earlier to just the transformation that needs to happen across Australia and across the world to reduce emissions. So we looked at the need for further policy development. A lot of the government's policies are currently calibrated towards delivering the 2030 target. So the capacity investment scheme, the new vehicle emissions standard, the safeguard mechanism all have settings which are pointing at 2030. We need a policy suite that goes beyond 2030, that creates the certainty and the investment conditions that are needed so that investors can get on to do what they need to do and invest in the abatement opportunities. We need to get on with rolling out clean energy infrastructure. And I think the challenges there are sort of increasingly well documented around complicated and lengthy planning and approval processes, both at the Commonwealth and the state level, concerns around community awareness, community social licence, and the need to be able to bring communities along with what we need to do and ensure an equitable sharing of the benefits and the burdens in the transitions associated, particularly in the regions, with rolling out infrastructure. We also looked at other issues around the export side of things, so not so fundamentally associated with our domestic emissions, but absolutely a need to work with our trading partners for our mutual benefit in the net zero transition and ensuring that Australia maintains a place in global supply chains as a low emission supplier of goods and services. And then looking at issues around workforce constraints, which we've heard a little bit about already, and just the information and data that we need people to have access to make informed decisions as they're looking to reduce their emissions and looking to make plans in a world where we are experiencing increasing climate change. I shall leave it there.
Thank you, Brad, for that excellent overview. And I'm very sorry about the technical difficulties with that. We will get the slides up for the discussion session so that we can see them. But I think this provides a really fantastic sort of expansion of Matt's sort of discussion of the review, and then is actually a really wonderful way to transition into our next speaker, Adam McKissack, who is the Chief Energy Economist and Head of the Energy Economics area at the Australian Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. So this is a relatively new function that was established in 2023 to build a stronger economics and data capability to inform energy policy. And it's going to be leading work on the government's electricity and energy sector net zero plan. And so it's going to be taking the work of the Climate Change Authority and building upon that to help drive the government's planning around net zero. So Adam joined DECU in 2022, working in the Strategic Policy Division, but prior to that, he has also worked with the Business Council of Australia, Australian Treasury, the ATO, as well as representing Australia at our embassy in Beijing for a number of years. So I'm really delighted to hear more about, what the government is doing in this space and the busy months that you have ahead. So I'd like to welcome Adam now.
Thank you, Chell, for the intro. Thanks, ANU, for inviting DECU to this really important event. It's great to be part of it. I'm very excited that the slides have shown up. I was wondering what I was going to do about my PowerPoint. I can't talk about it. So I'll just give a bit of an overview of the energy sector plan work we're doing and just a bit of a context for it, just to set up the discussion we're going to have a bit later. So, I mean, as we've heard, the government has a plan for net zero by 2050. It's got interim targets for 2030, 43% reduction on 2005 emissions levels. It needs to form a 2035 target next year, and that will be informed by, as we've heard, advice from the Climate Change Authority, as well as the 6 sectoral plans that are being developed, but really are there to sort of outline what are the actual pathways to get to these targets. So it's good to have a target, but how are we going to get there, and how are we going to make changes in each of these 6 sectors of the economy to get us to each of those targets and to ultimately to net zero. So obviously my work is really about the top left, the electricity and energy sector, and how we're going to get that sector to contribute to that broader task. So obviously electricity and energy, it's key. Most emissions come from burning fossil fuels, essentially. So about 85% of net emissions are from burning fossil fuels. It doesn't all happen in the energy sector itself. It happens in a lot of other sectors, which is why the 6 plans are very important. And really, and I think we've already heard this, a lot of reductions we've had to date have really been through electricity decarbonisation. So that has been sort of first port of call in terms of where we can reduce emissions. And really, so 91% of emissions reduction outside of a land sector, that's an important qualification since 2016, has come from electricity decarbonisation. So this shift has been driven by the shift to renewables, as we've already heard. It's about 25% of electricity generation has been displaced by renewables. So if we look out to 2050, we are going to have to see quite a big change in the energy mix overall. At the moment, about 20% of energy comes from electricity. It's only about 20%. Gas is something similar. Over half of energy is from liquid fuels, so diesel and petrol. So I think as we look out to 2050, we're going to see quite a change in that energy mix that we need to basically oversee through the sector plan process. So obviously coal, which sits behind a lot of electricity generation, we're trying to get that to basically zero. Electricity will probably at least double its share of that energy mix, and obviously be mostly renewables by the time we get to 2050. Gas will be an important part of the system, but we expect it to reduce its share over time. Bioenergy will become more important, so biofuels, biogas, becoming a bigger part of our energy mix. And of course, hydrogen, something the government's investing quite heavily in to be an increasingly important part of our mix, particularly as we get to the end of that period to 2050. So I think, yeah, if we're talking in another 25 years' time, I think we'll be looking at quite a different pie chart in terms of where energy comes from in Australia. So just to sort of talk a bit about the sector plan, and obviously work in progress, but to give you a bit of a sense of what are the kind of 4 big themes we're focusing on in developing this plan. And the first we've heard a lot about already. So decarbonising electricity has been a real focus of policy, supported by the 82% renewables target by 2030. That's underpinned by the capacity investment scheme, things like Rewiring the Nation, which is getting that transmission rollout through the country. So a lot of investment to really kind of very dramatically really lift that renewables build between now and 2030. And obviously the sector plan will have to think about, well, what do we do post 2030? And I think, you know, when we think about that market, we're not thinking about a market that has quite as much intervention as the one we have now. So once you've decarbonised the grid, then you start thinking about, well, what can we electrify and what can we do about energy performance? So that's really the second kind of key plank in this process. A bit of work has been done to support households to transform their energy performance through things like the Energy Upgrades Fund. We now have a COP28 energy efficiency pledge. So that pledge is to basically double the rate of growth of energy efficiency between now and 2030. So I think that is a bit of a motivator for policy in terms of raising our rates of energy efficiency. And obviously thinking about how do we facilitate electrification, where can we do it, what are the obstacles to doing it in the short term. And I guess really going to the third and fourth planks here, you know, we will still have gas in the system, we'll still have liquid fuels in the system out to 2050. So how do we look at sort of lower carbon alternatives to the fossil fuel sources we have currently? So obviously, you know, as I've said, a lot of work going into hydrogen as an alternative source. Also need to think about things like low carbon gases. We also need to think about how we manage the supply and demand of gas during this transition period. On the liquid fuel side, you know, I think a lot of money going into developing an industry in Australia through the Future Made in Australia plan. And obviously we need to start thinking about how do you build that market for low carbon liquid fuels. So there's a huge amount of content in all of those 4 things, but those are the sort of 4 broad stages we're thinking about. And really the last thing I just wanted to say, I think sort of Frank sort of said this already, it's a huge transformation, it's a huge economic transformation. We're kind of a fossil fuel superpower now. We want to be a clean energy superpower. So how do we make, it's a big transition for Australia, probably more than many countries, right? And we really can make that contribution to the broader global net zero transition. So yeah, so very fossil fuel intensive, a lot of investment to get us from the left-hand side of this chart to the right, but just worth keeping in mind is how big that transition is. So I'll leave my comments there to keep it short and save questions for the panel. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Adam. That was a really fascinating sort of deep dive into some of the very challenging issues that the government's going to have to address as they develop the net zero plan. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Associate Professor Emma Aisbett. Emma is at the ANU School of Law, and she's Associate Director of Research for the ANU Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Initiative. So her current research is focused around green industrial policy and trade-related climate policies, which as a trading nation, the questions that are very relevant to Australia. And she leads projects on embedded emissions accounting frameworks in collaboration with Australian industry and government. She is published in a range of leading academic journals and collaborates with organisations including the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the OECD, the World Economic Forum and the Australian government. I've had the pleasure of working with Emma on the Grand Challenge for Zero Carbon Energy in Asia Pacific. She's one of my PhD supervisors. She's also on my list of smart people that I go to ask advice. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce her today. Thanks.
Thanks also from me, Chell. You're a wonderful introducer, very kind. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. my role is a little bit to speak to what my other panelists have spoken to, and also to try and tie in what ANU's role is and how we contribute in some of these spaces. So it gave me the great excuse to actually read at least the summary version of the sectoral pathways review from the Climate Change Authority. And I really was struck actually when I sort of flicked towards the end and looked at the obstacles and the ways we could remove those obstacles. Reverse engineering, perhaps at great danger, the CCA's approach, and recognising that, of course, not only modelling and science underpins the Climate Change Authority's reports, but also a great deal of stakeholder engagement and talking to the people that matter in this country for these transitions. What struck to me what some of the barriers seem to be answering the questions of what does Australia, perhaps even at the individual firm level, need in order to be able to decarbonise? So it seemed that they were recognising that we need information for strategy and planning. We also need the inputs for clean production. So although I'm at the law school, I'm actually an economist. So thinking like an economist, it seemed that they were recognising the need for human capital. They were seeing the need for physical capital in terms of clean technologies, and the need for the land on which to build these things. And last but not least, they were recognising the need to build demand for the clean products that we might actually produce if we get all those other things together. That all makes a lot of sense, but I think it's worth noting, and I think perhaps celebrating, some of the things that the report doesn't seem to suggest we need to worry as much about anymore. For example, not on the list was how on earth do we convince industry that they need to decarbonise? And this is a big change, especially from 10 years ago. And I see Margie nodding at me. Also, Australian industry is really smart. And from my collaborations with industry and research projects, I know that they're really frontier in this regard. So one of the other things that wasn't in the report in a big way was how do we help industry figure out how to do this? How do we give them the brains? They've already got the brains. And also not prioritised in the report was how do we finance this? And I think that's really important. There are a lot of countries in the world for which how do we finance this transition is absolutely the number one question. Yet in Australia, we have so many prerequisites, including a well-established, reliable trade and investment sort of relationship, that finance is not necessarily the top of our list. So firstly, I want to say fantastic that those things are no longer top of the list of concerns for Australia. And we can get on, I think, with enabling Australians and enabling Australian industry to get on with the job by making sure they have the information, the inputs they need, and helping them create demand for their clean products. So, of course, my reverse engineering arose from the obstacles that were identified to these enabling factors. So it was noted that we definitely still need a lot more information, that there are information and data gaps that firms and individuals need to be filled in order to make strategic decisions. We've already heard about workforce constraints. Do we have enough engineers? Do we have enough technicians? Do we have enough people who are trained in working with communities to explain transition and the need for infrastructure? Supply chain constraints around clean technology, and notably the idea that we should work together with our trading partners and try to make sure that our supply chains are resilient and secure. The importance of regulatory barriers not being greater than are necessary. Now, this is a really tricky one, of course. As soon as with my personal ideological inclinations, as soon as I hear someone talking about getting rid of green tape, my alarm bells go off and I think, oh my goodness, they're just going to try and get rid of our environmental protections. We can't afford to do that. Obviously, we can't ruin one aspect of the environment, even if we're trying to save the other. But there are certainly ways in which we can try and streamline and reduce unnecessary burden for people who are actually trying to do the right thing for us all. And of course, last but very much not least, the issue of social license, of making sure that benefits are shared equally and costs are not borne by the few. Last but not least, I think the Climate Change Authority framed it as a lack of willingness to pay the green premium. And in my economic jargon, I might refer to that as a lack of sufficient market and regulatory signals. So I totally agree with that perspective, because, you know, working with industry, there is so much desire to move on this transition to become green producers, but ultimately they have shareholders, and it's a very hard sell for all these very intelligent and hardworking people to say, yes, well, let's transition and let's go broke while we're at it. So I'm happy to say that ANU has been working for quite a few years to address all of these obstacles, and we continue to do so. So we have colleagues like Yorick Gossens, Fiona Beck, and many others who work on filling those on filling those information gaps about things like, what is the potential for Australia? What are our comparative advantages? Which technologies are going to be the best and most efficient? So techno-economic studies, detailed studies of what demand from our major markets like China might look like for our resources, from coal to iron ore. We also educate, of course. So regarding the skill shortage, of course, we are part of Australia's tertiary education system, and I think ANU's sustainability engineering is a leading example of helping to train the sort of thinkers that we need. Of course, at the law school, we need a whole bunch of fabulous lawyers to figure out those regulatory barriers. We have colleagues like Rebecca Colvin and Sarah Bice at the Crawford School, who do amazing work when it comes to social licence for both infrastructure and broader energy projects. And I'm pleased to say we have people who work on international green economy collaborations. Frank Yotso, of course, being one of those, Yorick Gossens, Tung Do, Paul Burke, and of course, my own research interests in this area. I think last but definitely not least, market and regulatory design. So ANU has a very long and distinguished history in this regard. So again, Paul Burke, Frank Yotso, Jack Pezzi, Warwick McKibben, Andrew McIntyre, sorry. These are all literally household names in Australia for really everything from carbon pricing to how do you design better ACCUs that actually work. And so I think I'll leave it there, but help summarise to say ANU stands ready, as always, to continue helping with the transition. Thank you.
So I thought I might begin, because we are at the ANU, by asking Emma to elaborate a little bit. You spoke a lot about what colleagues around the ANU are doing, but you're doing some very innovative research in this space yourself, Emma. So I thought it'd be great to start off and hear a little bit more about the work you're doing around green industry policies and trade-related climate policies.
Thanks so much, Chell. I always love talking about what I research. Actually, I think towards the end of maybe Adam's presentation, there was this concept of market activation. And in fact, one of the research hats I wear is as theme leader for market activation in the ARC Industrial Transition Research Hub for carbon recycling and utilisation. Think, for example, those low carbon liquid fuels. And a very large part of this market activation is really the certification and verification of the embedded emissions in these products. So if we're going to try and market our iron, our hydrogen, our sustainable aviation fuels as cleaner and better, And if we're expecting industry to take on the cost of that transition, because the green products will be more expensive for some time, we do need those market signals. And we're not going to get those market signals if the market doesn't trust that those products are actually green, if they're thinking that this is just greenwashing. And so my team at ANU do a lot of work on embedded emissions accounting frameworks. And in fact, it's an absolute pleasure that we work very closely with the Australian Government and the Climate Change Authority and DECU, actually both, on these, because I think Australia's Guarantee of Origin scheme is actually world leading. And just earlier today, I was invited by DFAT to talk to all the members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity on exactly on how we can work together, how governments of that grouping can work together to make sure that our embedded emissions accounting systems are interoperable. Because, of course, from a trade perspective, if we all design our own emissions accounting systems, all we're really going to be generating is a whole lot of non-tariff barriers to trade. So it's really important that we work together.
Thanks, Emma. And yeah, I mean, I think as someone who's worked in the sort of emissions protection space, making sure, that we have these settings right will make such a massive difference to, accelerating the transition and the efficiency of the transition. Now I wanted to sort of ask a question broadly to the panel, because it's something that's sort of come through all of the presentations today. But, the sectoral pathways report really it notes that workforce shortages are already a barrier or being cited as a barrier in nearly every part of the economy. And so I was interested to hear sort of different perspectives from the panel on what you found researching the sectoral pathways review, Brad, and some of the strategies that the government might be able to take to address some of these issues. Adam and Emma.
Thanks. Very good question. So I think absolutely critical we have the workforce we need to support the transition, and it will be quite a different looking workforce to the one we have today. And I think there was a really good piece of work that Jobs and Skills Australia did last year, but really tried to go through and model exactly what we'll need out over the coming decades across different occupations. So I think it is recognised within government as a key enabler we need to support the transition, along with things like social licence and things like supply chain. You've got to have all those things in place to support the scale of transition we're looking at. I think, there are a lot of things we need to look at in the space. It goes to your TAFE system, your skills development, and, where the skills are. A lot of this transition happens in the regions. So do you have the right training in regional places to support these things? Is your skilled migration system set up in the right way, targeting the right skills? So I think it is critical, and it is very widely recognised within government as an issue we need to tackle as part of a transition.
Yeah, and I mean, does anyone else want to speak to that?
Thanks. Yes, I'd echo what Adam has said, and we certainly referenced the piece of work that Jobs and Skills Australia had done in the Pathways Review. So I think all the sorts of considerations that one tends to think about when it comes to labour market issues are certainly relevant here. So the importance of ensuring that our high school, tertiary and vocational training programs are pointing in the right direction. Thinking about how we can enhance workforce mobility, as Adam's mentioned. A lot of the transition is a transition that's happening in remote and regional parts of Australia. So it's not just about having the right training in the right places, but also being able to move workers in and out as required. And how can we recognise that need and encourage it? I think issues around workforce diversity and addressing that can help us improve workforce participation. And so that can play an important role as well. And yes, we're going to need more electricians, right? We're talking about the need to decarbonise the economy and to electrify a lot of activities across the economy. We're going to need more electricians, we're going to need more engineers, we're going to need more construction workers, but not necessarily all at once and not all at the same place at the one time. So policy has to be alive to a range of different considerations.
Thanks, Brad. And I mean, I think from the ANU's perspective, the work that we do around the region in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, these skill shortages exist there as well, and it's going to be an enormous challenge to scale up on both our own workforce, but then to help facilitate the same sorts of the skills provision around Southeast Asia. Before I open it up, I did also want to ask a couple of more questions around some of the specific challenges and barriers to sort of accelerating the transition to net zero. And one of the things that comes up, a lot, both in Australia and internationally, are the challenges in reconfiguring electricity grids and transmission for renewable energy and storage. I was very interested to see, sort of perhaps how all of you touch upon it. But yeah, would someone like to, or one or a couple of you like to speak to those challenges domestically and then internationally?
Well, just briefly, and I'll invite the other panel members to jump in. It is a major transformation, and I think it's probably reasonably well understood by a lot of people in the audience that we're moving from a system where we have a relatively small number of electricity generators just operating 24 hours, pumping out fossil fuel-based electricity, to a system that is quite different, much more dispersed in terms of our generation sources, with wind and solar, both large scale and particularly with solar small scale, a massive and different coordination exercise. The electricity network, in a sense, can be regarded as one great big machine, right, that runs from the north of Queensland, and talking about the national electricity market, all the way down to Tasmania and across to South Australia. And so coordinating all of that to ensure that the supply of electricity just neatly meets what's being demanded at any one time, and enabling that to happen safely is a really massive task, even when you're operating with the traditional system, let alone a decarbonised one. And in some ways, this is a big experiment, and we have to ensure that all the different pieces are going to work together. Australia is often viewed as a leader here. When you look at how much renewable energy we have across Australia, and in particular places like South Australia, where it can reach 100% of what's being supplied at any point in time, that is informing efforts around the rest of the world in terms of how that can all be managed and made to work.
Thanks. So just maybe to add to that, certainly, we have some quite useful tools to address the transmission build. So we've got the Australian Energy Market Operator issues its integrated systems plan. So that actually looks at the transmission requirements we need around the country. And I think, the estimate out to 2050 is 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines. So the task is pretty huge. That's why the government has put, a lot of money behind transmission. So the Rewiring the Nation fund provides about 20 billion of concessional financing for transmission. So I think, there's a lot of effort going into that rollout. It has its challenges. I think people like the idea of clean energy. They don't like the idea of transmission lines going through their properties. So there's issues of social license. I think this has been raised already today, and it really is a key issue. So I think, it does. There's a lot of challenges, but I think there's a lot of investment going into resolving that challenge to support the transition.
Can I just jump in? And this is not my research expertise, but Saul Griffith is an old mate of mine. And I was quizzing him on the weekend because various people who seem to know what they're talking about kept saying there's, in the least cost energy system, there's going to be X and Y gas still, and they were quite surprisingly high numbers. And he did point out that so much of the modelling is sort of done at the distribution level, and that really, if we want to understand what a least cost system is, we have to look all the way delivered to the customers, be they industry or households. And that is when you really see the importance of these household and community type solutions, because there's actually a very large chunk, I think it's about 20% of the cost of your electricity delivered as a household is actually from that sort of last sort of micro level distribution. So understanding that, it has a big cost, and it also means if we need to, if we can do more within communities, we need to build less transmission lines across the country and cause less division.
Yeah.
I might jump in there again. I mean, one thing to keep in mind here is that although demand for electricity in Australia has been relatively stable for quite some time now, as we're thinking about decarbonising the economy, we not only need to decarbonise an amount of electricity output consistent with what we have today, but when you look at our modelling, we've got electricity output doubling between now and 2050. And so that just goes again to the immensity of the scale of the task in terms of rolling out all the infrastructure that we need to support what is at least a doubling of our current electricity supply. And there are plenty of people who will tell you, well, actually, we need 3 or 4 or 5 times what we're currently producing if we're going to sort of realise that vision of Australia as a clean energy superpower. So that I think that's sort of something really important to keep in mind.
Well, thank you all. I think we could devote probably the whole hour to talking through some of the transmission challenges, but I think it will be really interesting to hopefully hear a little bit more about some of the social license issues around this in the next panel as well. So the final question that I'm going to ask is one that's also come up online in a sort of a slightly modified form as well. And so, Emma, as a trading nation, Australia needs to consider the climate consequences of different types of trade policies and vice versa. And currently, internationally, we're seeing a rise in a number of protectionist trade measures, as well as an increase in green industrial policy and other trade-related climate policies. And, I think it would be really useful to have for you to perhaps provide an overview of the key different types of policies in these areas and how they differ from one another, because it's, one of those areas I think that traditionally climate and energy sort of policymakers haven't really, thought of about as much.
Thanks, Chell. Yeah, a lot of the work that I do is indeed at this trade and climate nexus. And a useful distinction that I find is actually distinguish between trade-related climate policies and climate-related trade policies. So a trade-related climate policy is actually something that is, its primary focus, at least ostensibly, is a climate objective, but it will have trade or trade policy implications. So a carbon border adjustment mechanism is an example of a trade-related climate policy. The Australian Guarantee of Origin scheme is also a trade-related climate policy. And you can contrast that with these climate-related trade policies, which are really essentially trade policies that have climate impacts. And a great example of that is, for example, the tariffs that the US are putting on Chinese electric vehicles. Okay, that is a trade protectionist policy that has serious and seriously negative climate implications because it's raising the cost of the green transition. So really important to distinguish between these sort of trade type things, those that are lowering the cost of the net zero transition versus those that are raising it.
Well, I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about those different types of policies in the coming years. But now I'd like to open it up to the audience. Please take advantage of the opportunity to ask all of the experts that we have here today the key issues on your mind. I can see a hand up over here. And if there's anybody else that has questions, one up the back. Yep, we will, and then a gentleman over here. So we'll start here. We'll move up and then move over.
Hi, this is Anshika from Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So my question is, to meet the 82% renewable energy target, AEMO ISP identified that Australia needs 6 gigawatt of renewable energy annually, up from the current 4 gigawatt. So do you think this is realistically possible for Australia to achieve this target? And also adding to that question, do you recognize the role of gas that do you recognize the role natural gas will play during this transition?
Well, I'll definitely be the person who says yes on the 82%. We are throwing a lot of policy at the 82% target. Yes, we do have to ramp up the rate of build very quickly, but the capacity investment scheme is a massive program. It's aimed at delivering 32 gigawatts of capacity. The early tenders have been vastly oversubscribed. So there is huge interest in investors coming to the program. We talk to investors all the time. There's huge interest in Australia as a clean energy destination. So we do think about sort of support, and obviously working with states and territories through renewable energy transformation agreements will get the states' contribution as well. So we do think, yes, look, it is ambitious. We're at about 39% renewables on the NEM at the moment. We have moved a lot already, and there's a lot of policy action coming. On gas, yes, it does need to be part of a transition. A very high share of renewable system needs firming capacity. Gas, at the moment, at least, looks like the least cost, or gas power generation does look like the least cost way of providing that. So I think it does need to be part of a mix, particularly at least between now and 2050. But I'll see if my fellow panelists have a different view.
Thanks. So one of the roles of the Climate Change Authority is to provide an annual progress report to the Climate Change Minister each year to inform his annual climate change statement. So we are assessing progress across all of the economy in terms of how we're tracking for emissions reductions. Would broadly agree with the things that Adam has said, but it is a massive task, a massive challenge. And I think the main thing is we get nearabouts to 82% in terms of the bigger picture of achieving Australia's 2030 emissions reduction target of minus 43% on 2005 levels. But we also need to look beyond 2030 because we're also preparing advice, obviously, on the 2035 target, and consistent with the Paris Agreement. Successive commitments under the Paris Agreement do need to represent an increase in ambition, and we will need to accelerate further beyond our current interim target to be consistent with that. So there are really big challenges. I think the government is pursuing measures to address all of those. Response to the community engagement review is, I think, another important element here as we're trying to get the network expanded. And I think per Matt Keen's comments earlier, probably an increased focus on the demand side of the electricity market in terms of how can we better pursue energy efficiency to reduce at the margin the need for incremental build of the system. How can we get better demand side response signals into the market so that we reduce the peak demand periods and again can reduce the incremental need for investment, which tends to be incredibly expensive to run to get the returns needed when we're in those peak periods. How can we make better use of the existing network, the existing distribution system, these sorts of things.
Well, thanks both. I think, that is a very comprehensive overview of, the challenge, but also all the things that we're doing. And I, personally echo the energy demand side. I was really pleased to see so much attention given to that in the sectoral pathways review. So I think we have someone up the back. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. And I have two questions. First of all, I think you are now working on updating NDC. And have there been any social and economic background changes when you compared to 5 years ago when you consider NDC? For example, stakeholders and industry you consider important. And second question is what are barriers and contributors to ambitious NDC in Australia?
So we might get Adam to take that question. Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to start. So in terms of how the context has changed compared with 5 years ago, I think we have a situation now where and there's a few things, and this was alluded to earlier in terms of I think the business community is, much more strongly behind strong action on climate change than it was, well, certainly 10 years ago when the government was framing the 2030 target. And I think, so that's very important. I think generally across Australia, there's more general acceptance of what we need to achieve to address climate change. We have legislated targets now, so just that's still only been something we've had for a couple of years. If you look at policies across all the states and territories of Australia, where we have net zero commitments and some quite ambitious interim targets, that's a fairly recent development as well, but all pointing in the right direction. Now, that's not to say that we've got the consensus that we ideally would have politically across Australia. It's not to say that there's not still a need to address real concerns that people have in their communities about the transition and what it means for them. And I think there's still a lot of important work to do in those areas.
Well, I think looking at the time, this has gone in a flash, so we might actually move over. I think we have one more question over here from the gentleman in the red jumper, and then we're going to have to wrap up for this session, and I think we have an afternoon tea break. It's not.
Does that work? Yeah, that.
Those online, just bear with us a second. We're just sorting mic issues, which is always challenging.
Got the magic touch there. I wonder if the panel. Okay. Could the panel just dig more into what's happening in terms of getting gas out of the system towards 2050? As I see it, batteries, 8-hour batteries are coming on. They can pretty well replace almost gas peaking plants for firming and for power storage. I see that there's a lot of resistance in the mining industry to getting gas out of the domestic supply, and I'd just like some comments on how difficult that's going to be. And finally, just how soon will sorry, there's just one other thing I just wanted to check with Adam. He talks about low carbon gas. I mean, are you just talking about hydrogen? I assume you're not talking about the gas we mine out of Australia. But anyway, finally, just how quickly can we get industry out of the gas and into hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's one we're still working through. I mean, we certainly know gas will be an important part of a system out to 2050, but we expect it to be a smaller part of a system out to 2050. And you've really got three sources of demand. You've got households, you've got industrial, and you've got gas power generation. We know gas power generation will need to be there for, at least for a period to firm renewables in the system. I think the household use is probably the easier one to address, and we do anticipate that falling quite rapidly. A couple of states and territories have specific policies aimed at getting people off gas. So Victoria and the ACT are banning new connections from certain dates. So I think we do anticipate household use declining quite significantly over time. I think industrial, we need to work through that. It's harder. There are some processes where you really can't electrify under current technology. So I think that needs to be worked through. I think hydrogen will be a good solution over time. We're not there yet, but we're investing heavily in it. But I think, that is one that, is an option for the next kind of 10, 20, 30 years. So I think we're sort of working on all kind of those three sources of demand. On a question about what do we mean by low carbon gas, definitely hydrogen is your sort of ultimate low carbon gas, but also thinking about things like biogas. So gas generated through, waste processes or through, biological feedstocks, etc. And that's an area where I think we need to do a bit more work and look at sort of how we can kind of produce those gases on a kind of commercial scale at a reasonable cost. So those are some areas we're looking at.
Well, thanks so much, Adam. I think, these are very complex and tricky questions. And, we look forward to sort of hearing updates from you down the track about, next steps in that regard. Well, I think summing up today's session, what we've seen is, that there is, a huge opportunity here from Australia to move from, as Adam so eloquently put it, being a fossil fuels superpower to being a renewable energy superpower. But, doing so will require bold thinking, as Matt Keane said, and we will need to, to undertake ambitious policy reforms, but also be very, agile and realistic in sort of sourcing investment and helping to facilitate the transition. So I'd like to thank the panelists for all of their, excellent insights. We're now moving outside to have a tea break till I think 3:45. So roughly half an hour, but really look forward to hearing more from the experts in the next session. Thanks so much. Please thank the panelists.